newscasters are fresher with Anais, Quintela,
and Zaira, Livier. We're coming to you live on Tuesday, March 14th from Creative Tucson Studios in downtown Tucson.
First, the local headlines.
Adding to the widespread criticism of the Republicans' Affordable Care Act replacement, even a good boy Republican like Governor Doug Ducey isn't crazy about the legislation. On a KFYI Phoenix radio show last week, Ducey said the health care bill still needs some work, although it is still better than the Affordable Care Act, which he says has a weak third act. Ducey said that he's happy to see the ACA go away, but he admits that it has some good points, such as the rule that forbade insurers for denying coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. However, he said that the replacement still doesn't give the country's governors what they want the most, which is flexibility to apply the law to their own unique states. He says that the new law is still too one-size-fits-all to work on a nationwide level. Ducey did send a letter to Congress in January explaining that he would like to see a health care plan. The most important item was flexibility to cap people covered by Medicaid and deadlines to reapply to the program. He also wrote that hospitals should not be left on the financial hook for covering the increased healthcare costs. And finally, Ducey's wish list asks that the new healthcare bill include free penis enhancements for all U.S. governors who have alliterative names.
While there is a construction boom across the country, Arizona is not experiencing an uptick in construction jobs. This is impacting the amount of time it takes to build houses in the state. Arizona economist Rick Merritt says that the state employs only 134,000 construction workers, a steep decline from the 240,000 that were employed at the peak of the housing boom in 2006. Last year, the state gained only 4,000 construction jobs, while 58,000 construction jobs were added nationwide just last month. Merritt says that home builders and contractors frequently complain that there isn't enough labor to fit the demand. One upside is that contractors have been offering higher wages for help in building houses. But the other side is that this makes it more expensive to build houses in Arizona, which could cause home buyers to seek out other states. And the current state of affairs is causing houses to take longer to be built. Greg Berger, the R.L. Brown president, says that building time should lessen as the economy strengthens and the labor force increases. If that doesn't work, the state of Arizona will seek help from the president by proposing the construction of a series of big, beautiful four-walled structures where people can live inside.
A recently introduced bill would loosen rules protecting the Mexican gray wolf. The law was introduced by Arizona Senator Jeff Flake. If passed, it would require the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to work with states and counties to sustain the wolf populations without impacting the local supply of livestock and wild game. Since reintroduction efforts began over 20 years ago, the gray wolf population has increased to such a degree that farmers claim that animals prey on their livestock. Under the bill, Fish and Wildlife Service has until next November to develop a plan to protect both the wolf and the livestock. If no plan is made, then the decision will default to the states. Environmentalists have criticized the law because they think that it can harm the wolf population. Michael J. Robinson of the Center for Biological Diversity says that the legislation doesn't just let the fox guard the hen house, but also gives the fox the title and the deed. Robinson believes that decisions about the wolf population should be made using science, not politics, which he says will be the case if this bill passes. He says that the bill would put a cap on when an animal can be taken off the endangered species list, even if the scientific community disagrees. But Flake says that the current system isn't working and it's having a negative impact on local farmers in Arizona, and his bill will help the state's rural communities. Mexican gray wolves were almost killed off in the 70s because of the threat they posed to cattle. But in 1998, the reintroduction efforts began, but they were slow because of poaching and inbreeding. There were 113 Mexican gray wolves in Arizona and New Mexico as of 2016, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service. This was an increase from the 97 counted a year earlier. Patrick Bray of the Arizona Cattlemen's Association says that local ranchers should have input to develop a plan because they're most impacted by the wolves. He says that wolves' impact can be devastating and knows of at least one rancher who lost 18 heads of cattle to wolves. Flake says that if his legislation fails, then he will personally wrestle these predatory wolves to the ground, hog-tie them, and display them in the town square as a warning to other wolves.
3 months after he walked away from his tent city and out of our hearts forever, Arizona taxpayers are still paying for former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and not just spiritually. A KTAR news report says taxpayers paid over $108 million over 24 years to settle lawsuits against the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. This includes $25 million paid for the case of Ortega Melendres, which accused the Sheriff's Office of racial profiling and refusing a judge's order to stop the practice. Out of that $25 million, $2.5 million per year is spent monitoring the Sheriff's Office to make sure that the profiling has not continued. The continuing toll on taxpayers show that Arizona is still haunted by the ghost of Joe Arpaio, and not just because Joe Arpaio has taken to wandering around downtown Phoenix in a white sheet. But the financial toll might soon come to an end. The trial for the Melendres case begins in April, and if found guilty, Arpaio will have to pay the criminal penalty himself, which he'll pay with unopened pairs of pink underwear and office equipment he took from the sheriff's office.
Researchers at the University of Arizona discovered a new approach that could save millions of tons of crops each year. They focus on a common fungus that's been known to stunt children's growth, increase the risk of liver cancer, and makes people more susceptible for diseases like HIV and malaria. The team created genetically engineered corn to produce RNA molecules that prevent the fungi from producing aflatoxin, the substance that makes the corn unsafe for consumption. The transgenic corn has been successful at keeping the toxic fungus under control. U of A professor and study leader Monica Schmidt says that while aflatoxin isn't usually deadly, it will make you really sick. The study was funded by the Bill and Melinda Foundation and set out to see whether the RNA change could be used as a weapon to fight the spread of the fungus. They used an approach called host-induced gene silencing, or HIGS, which stops the production of the toxic RNA. Schmidt compared their approach to using a Trojan horse to shut off the toxins. The small RNA molecules were injected into the edible parts of the corn. She says that the Higgs approach has advantages over other methods because it stops the crop from creating the toxin instead of treating the crop after the toxin has already been created, such as the use of pesticides. While the team found success with the approach, it still needs to go under multiple rounds of field testing until it is used on a wider scale. But Schmidt is hopeful that the Higgs method will be used for different crops to increase food security around the world. Next, the team of researchers hopes to discover why eating a Chipotle burrito causes your stomach to stage a violent revolt against the rest of your body.
One of life's great questions. And I wanted to take a moment first to give a shout out to our boy Arlo watching our show right now in California, but also to talk about the program you're watching right now. Here at 5 on 20, we are undertaking a new kind of citizen journalism. We're going to give you the news as we see it, and we want more people to speak up with us. We need writers, hosts, anchors, camera people, sound people, the whole gamut. The times require a new way of informing ourselves. So join us. Do it. Do it now. Email us at info@creativetucson.org to get involved. And if you think there's a story we're missing, a person we should interview, an upcoming event we should cover, or have any news tips for us, shoot an email to info@creativetucson.org. We're here for you, and we want to cover all stories from all points of views. So don't be strangers. And now, in international and national news.
The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, claims that 24 million people will go without health insurance under the new Affordable Care Act replacement. according to a recent study. The report said that an additional 14 million people would lose insurance in 2018 under the healthcare bill, which is temporarily being called the American Health Care Act. The CBO report showed a larger impact on uninsured Americans than anyone thought and runs counter to Trump's promise that the plan would provide, quote, insurance for everybody. I guess there's an alternate meaning for everybody because 24 million would go uninsured by 2026 under this bill, mostly due to changes in Medicaid funding. And 7 million people would lose insurance through their employers because they can choose to go uninsured now that the penalty for lacking insurance would no longer be in place. Some employers would also decline to offer insurance because they're no longer legally required to do so. In terms of price, the CBO estimated that the premiums would initially increase 15 to 20% after the repeal, but would eventually decrease 10% by 2026. The report also said that out-of-pocket costs and deductibles would rise because of looser regulations for insurance companies under the Republican legislation. The only bright side of the report was that the legislation would decrease the deficit by $337 billion over a decade due to decreased Medicaid spending. However, if Trump gets his budget wishes, then he looks to increase military funding by $54 billion per year, which would add up to $540 billion over 10 years, eclipsing the savings found in the report. Some Republicans admitted that the plan isn't ideal, with Republican Senator Lindsey Graham saying that if half of what's in the report is true, then they should, quote, slow down. More straightforward, Republican Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, previously a physician, said that the plan is, quote, awful, but that Republicans didn't let the awful score deter their goals to destroy Obama's legacy. Newt Gingrich continued to be Newt Gingrich and called for the CBO to be abolished because it's become too politicized. Gingrich said that he didn't trust a single word they published. A Fox News reporter then told him that Republicans appointed the director of the CBO, and then Gingrich began sweating and quickly ran off set. Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price also doubted the veracity of the report, saying that, quote, we disagree strenuously with the report and called it virtually impossible to have 14 million people lose coverage in 2018, yet he didn't explain why. Trump joined on the CBO bashing, accusing the agency of spying on him through his toaster oven, which is why he gave up his daily breakfast of blueberry Pop-Tarts.
What a shame. The New York Attorney General is accusing the Secretary of State of using an alias email when he discussed climate change issues when he was CEO of ExxonMobil. Attorney General Eric Schneiderman's office revealed that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson used the name Wayne Tracker in emails from 2008 to 2015. The name was used in emails that involved discussions involving climate change, which Exxon publicly acknowledged in 2015 but denied in previous years. Tillerson was ordered to hand over emails as part of a subpoena issued by the New York AG department, but he neglected to release the Wayne Tracker emails or even admit to using the name. John Oleski, senior enforcement counsel at the AG's office, says that Tillerson used the secondary email address to send and receive materials related to risk management issues related to the climate change that was the focus of the investigation. Officials from the State Department and Exxon have not responded to requests by Bloomberg for comment, and Exxon has previously denied the allegations. Exxon is accused of covering up their knowledge of climate change despite allegedly knowing for over 20 years the risks of a warming planet caused by carbon emissions from fossil fuels. The Attorney General's office also learned that Tillerson uses the alias Strongbone Striker for use on dating sites and to post on 4chan forums.
The Trump administration is granting the CIA the power to launch drone strikes against suspected terrorists, according to a report by the Wall Street Journal. This would be a change from the Obama administration policy of limiting drone strikes to the military, although the CIA could use drones to locate suspected terrorists. That policy was more transparent because the Pentagon has to report details of drone strikes, while the CIA is free to do so as they please. The new authority was granted soon after Trump's inauguration and was used in February as the CIA led a strike against the senior al-Qaeda leader in Syria, Abu al-Masir, U.S. officials said that the authority is limited to actions in Syria, but the Wall Street Journal claims that Trump's order will allow them to operate in other areas. Christopher Anders of the ACLU in Washington said that the CIA should not be in the business of ordering lethal strikes, but should be limited to a role of locating targets only. He said that the CIA is meant to gather foreign intelligence, not to be a paramilitary force. In response, Trump said that the ACLU is meant to comfort snowflakes, not to be a one-stop shop for hot takes, and then he turned around and high-fived Steve Bannon. The CIA responded saying that the ACLU comments are unfair and that the CIA can become whatever they want to be as long as they believe in themselves.
Democratic lawmakers are asking for an investigation into the Justice Department's handling of an investigation into Deutsche Bank, which is Donald Trump's biggest creditor. Democrat Maxine Waters said that the president has too many conflicts of interest involving the bank in order to order a non-biased investigation into the bank. Deutsche Bank is accused of allowing a money laundering scheme that transferred more than $10 billion out of Russia. The bank has already paid $800 million in penalties from the case and is now being investigated by the Justice Department, who is ultimately run by the president. Last month, Deutsche Bank launched their own internal investigation into their connection with Trump to see if there were any suspicious links with Russia, but they found nothing. According to a report by Bloomberg, Trump owes about $300 million and has 4 mortgages filed with the bank. Waters requested that Republicans launch their own investigation to avoid the inherent conflicts of interest involving the president and suspicious ties between Trump's aides and Russian officials. This comes at the same time that Senator Cory Booker raised the issue of Russian links with newly confirmed Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross. Ross was formerly vice chair at the Bank of Cyprus and is accused of having past relationships with a group of Russian officials who were also investors in the bank. Booker also requested more information into Ross's links with Joseph Ackerman, who is now the chairman of the Bank of Cyprus and used to be CEO of, you guessed it, Deutsche Bank. What a douche.
An economic think tank studied corporate tax breaks and found that they don't really work but cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars per year. The incentives are used to lure companies to particular states, similar to the failed deal to bring Monsanto to the Marana area. The think tank, the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, studied 26 years of incentives in 33 states and found that businesses offset their state and local taxes by 30%, costing taxpayers $45 billion in 2015. Upjohn says that these tax breaks have tripled since 1990, when the database began tracking such information. According to their research, Upjohn said that the incentives had done little to convince companies to move. They wrote that some states offer incentives up to 3 times more than other states, but that didn't show much more economic growth than the states with lower incentives. Their conclusion is that states don't offer the incentives because they bring rewards, but rather because it is what they've always been doing. So in other words, it's business as usual. Job creation tax credits, or JCTCs, accounted for 2/3 of the incentives measured in the study. The point of these is that companies are given tax credits to create jobs, which looks great for politicians and great Twitter fodder for our president. But the report found that most of these jobs go to low-wage businesses that offer little chance of wage increases. They say that the incentives would be better spent on high-wage industries because it provides a multiplier effect, which means that the workers who are paid better tend to spend more money in the community to stimulate the economy. The author suggests that the money would be better spent on job training programs or to provide consultancy for struggling businesses. This way, they can say if the company ends up leaving the state, they'll at least have a well-trained workforce. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says that they will never work because a well-trained workforce won't pay for those alimony bills, 18 mortgages, and a team of high-priced Washington lobbyists.
The leader of Scotland is seeking a second referendum on Scottish independence in the wake of the Brexit discussions. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says that she will ask for permission from Parliament next Tuesday for the referendum to be held sometime in 2018 or early 2019, around the same time that the Brexit issue will be decided. The Scottish people overwhelmingly opposed Brexit, which contributed to the need for a vote on independence. Among Scottish voters, 62% voted to remain in the European Union, while 38% voted to leave. The UK as a whole voted 52% to leave, with 48% choosing to remain. Scotland last voted on independence in 2014, which was rejected by voters. So far, UK Prime Minister Theresa May has not said whether or not she will grant permission for the referendum, which is a bit ironic considering her support for the UK to leave the European Union. May said a second referendum would lead to, quote, uncertainty and division in Scotland, and she insisted that the Scots didn't want independence. But Sturgeon says Scots should be given the choice between becoming a sovereign nation or taking part in a so-called hard Brexit, which means a complete exit from the EU. In response to Sturgeon's comments, Theresa May glared sideways towards Wales as if to say, don't even think about it.
And let's take a gander real quick at a glamour shot of Kellyanne Conway. The Twitter sphere noticed this masterpiece on display in Conway's home during a recent television interview and exploded with glee. If you have a cute quip to describe the fur-clad firebrand, tweet it at us. We are FIVE on 20.
So many things I could say. Where do you even start, you know? This is Anais Quintela.
And Zaira Livier.
For 5 on 20 News. Next up, a deep dive into what's really happening with local politics.
Good evening and welcome again to Adelante Tucson, Tucson's new platform for political analysis. I am your host, Zaira Livier.
And I am your co-host, Edward Cott.
In the light of the new proposed Healthcare Act, today we are going to focus on healthcare policy. To begin, on Monday, March the 6th, the House of Representatives, Republican leadership backed by President Trump, rolled out their plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. The Republicans were hoping to ram their bill known as the American Health Care Act through Congress this month without an analysis of how many people would lose their insurance coverage or how much it would cost. So why their hurry and their need to keep drafts of the bill a secret? Because the so-called American Health Care Act would cause millions of Americans to lose their health care insurance, while millions more would face higher insurance costs.
As a matter of fact, just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office released its report on the proposed American Health Care Act, which estimated that 14 million Americans would lose health insurance the first year after the passage of this new Health Care Act. This number will rise to 24 million who would lose health insurance over the next 10 years. This will basically double the percentage working age adults who go without health insurance from 10% to 19%. This would save the federal government $200 billion, most of which will go to tax cuts that mainly benefit the rich. Over the 24 million people losing their health insurance, more than 14 million low-income Americans will lose their Medicaid coverage. This will have a special impact on the disabled, who make up more than 40% of Medicaid spending.
And equally outrageous, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act would provide a $600 billion tax cut for the wealthiest 2.5% of the population, while giving higher income households tax credits that are not currently available under the Affordable Care Act. This allocation of tax breaks from low-income households to the wealthiest American sectors will mark the largest transfer of wealth in American history. Under the Affordable Care Act, enrollment in Medicaid grew by almost 14 million people, reaching a total of more than 62 million in 2015. This increase would have been even bigger if 19 states, all with Republican leadership, had not blocked the Medicaid expansion in their states. The Republican-led American Health Care Act would cut back on Medicaid, first by cutting back federal aid to states who expanded Medicaid under Obama's Affordable Care Act, and then by converting Medicaid into a block grant for states.
Now, what is a grant block and why is it such a big deal? So far, the basic idea is that states would get fixed federal grants that would be based on the state and federal Medicaid spending in that state. The grant would grow slightly each year to account for inflation. However, the inflation adjustments are expected to be less than the medical inflation rate. Currently, states share the cost of Medicaid with the federal government, so poorer states pay less. The federal funding is open-ended, but in return, states must cover certain services and people. For instance, children, pregnant women who meet income criteria, and parents with dependent children. But under a block grant, states would have more freedom to decide who qualifies and for what services.
Now, how much freedom states will have will depend on the state government. Usually, states are given near unfettered flexibility. Many Republicans say that because states will have greater flexibility, they can innovate with their Medicaid programs. And we all know what innovation means to these people: less social services for the benefit of the rich minority. Further, lower-income households that make too much money to qualify for Medicaid would also lose their health insurance and end up paying much more. Under the Affordable Care Act, tax credits to help pay for private health insurance through the ACA exchanges are scaled by income, with lower-income households getting larger subsidies. Under the American Health Care Act, a refundable tax credit is only based on age, not income. Therefore, lower-income households would lose subsidies and would have to pay more to drop their health insurance, while higher-income households would gain a tax credit that was not available under Obama's Affordable Care Act.
So in addition, the Republican American Health Care Act would allow private health insurance companies to charge older people 5 times what they charge younger people, instead of the maximum 3 times under the Affordable Care Act. This will lead to more expensive health insurance for older Americans, especially those aged between 50 and 65 who are not eligible for Medicare. Some of these people will not be able to afford the higher premiums and be forced to drop their health insurance. But even seniors covered by Medicare will be put at risk, as one of the tax cuts under the American Health Care Act is a source of funding for Medicare. This will worsen Medicare's finances and open the door to cuts in Medicare in the future. The Republican American Health Care Act also does away with the employer mandate. For example, under the Affordable Care Act, larger businesses with more than 50 workers have to provide health insurance to their workers. In just the 10 years before the Affordable Care Act, 12 million workers and their family members lost employer health insurance as businesses cut costs to boost their profits. But under the Affordable Care Act, more than 8 million have regained health insurance from their jobs. The Republican American Health Care Act would lead to millions of workers losing their employer health insurance and either pay much more for private insurance or go without it.
Another problem is that the Republican repeal of the Affordable Care Act would cut $1 billion from public health programs aimed at epidemics, bioterrorism, and immunizations. These preventative efforts can and do save billions of dollars in healthcare costs and an unknown number of lives. Lastly, the American Health Care Act would also eliminate funding for Planned Parenthood. Currently, Planned Parenthood cannot get government funding for abortion services, which is a very small part of its overall program. But it is a major provider of healthcare services, especially to lower-income women without health insurance.
So with all that said, we'd like to discuss the novel concept of universal health care. 32 of the 33 developed nations have universal health care, with the U.S. being the lone exception. Universal health care should be understood as a fundamental human right. The right to access quality and affordable, whether preventive, wellness, or emergency services, is essential for any healthy and prosperous society. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the right to healthcare as a universal right for all people. The fact remains that the healthcare system in this country is entirely manipulated by the greedy for-profit interest of corporations and banks. This manipulation leads working and poor people directly into debt and bankruptcy, long-term health complications, and in some cases, even death.
We must then ask ourselves, why is the richest country in the world ranked last among 11 industrialized countries on measures of health system quality, efficiency, access to care, equity, and healthy lives? The U.S. was noted to have the highest costs while also displaying the lowest performance. In 2012, billing and insurance-related red tape cost the U.S. economy around $471 billion, and 80% of that was due to inefficiencies in our multi-payer system. A study from 2015 found that a single-payer system would save the U.S. $375 billion per year. Although a universal health care plan system is common sense policy, our government is more interested in debating tax breaks for the rich than actually serving the interests and social needs we all share as human beings.
So to finish it off today with a quote from Martin Luther King, which says, I quote, "We must begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thank you.